Chapter 1. Situation. The zoo you live in. Life is a setup. Have you ever experienced the frustration of being set up? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where there was little wiggle room to choose a winning response? The old damned if you do or damned if you don't dilemma? Consider this setup scenario. Someone cries, "Fire!" in a crowded theater, when really there is no fire. This is a sure setup for some sour responses. Visualize the chaos created by this false alarm. Sounds of sobbing and shrieking ring out as frantic people push toward exit doors, causing others to trip and fall. Bodies are bruised and even broken. All these noxious consequences because one mischievous creep cried out, "Fire!" and everyone in the crowded theater reacted as if the warning was reliable, each responding in their own way, depending upon the kind of creature they are. In the same way, you can expect life to present many unexpected and unwanted moments that will be a setup for frustration. Life is a setup because others can independently choose courses of action that impinge upon your personal path, just as you also impinge your preferences and prejudices upon others. So life is a setup for frustration, especially as people show little regard for the welfare and best interests of others and act in selfish ways. Life is a setup because some egocentrically seek profit, pleasure, power, and promotion at the expense of others. Situational setups. There are 5 fundamental sources that supply situations with frustration and possibly devastation to our lives. As these unwanted events occur, we are set up for misfortune and heartache. Accidents due to human error. Consequences of mechanical failure. Inconsiderate or abusive acts of others, untimely movements of Mother Nature, challenges due to ailments of the body. Making a firm commitment to changing your stripes means continually asking this essential question. As bad things happen to me and I am set up by situations beyond my control, how will I respond to these trials and troubles to further my greatest growth of character? This is a most critical question, because the way you respond to whatever life throws at you determines whether life is a drudgery or a delight. In the end, your happiness is not determined by what happens to you, but by how you respond to what happens to you. So, life is a setup. Welcome to Earth. Get used to it, get over it, and get on with it. However you respond, whether gracious or grumpy, you will act according to the disposition of the animal that you are presently. Anyone might respond well when surrounded by loving and patient people, but what comes out of you when the going gets tough? And by the way, the going will get tough. That's life. The way you respond to unkind or abusive acts, the way you respond to events of accident, nature, mechanical, or bodily failure, reveals who you are at the heart. How you handle hardships exposes the very core of your character. Changing your stripes means becoming the kind of creature that can and will respond with calm and clarity, even amid commotion. Changing your stripes means responding to life's toughest challenges with compassion rather than contempt. Becoming the kind of creature that will respond well to adversity is a key to contented and rich living. Cause versus constraint. In the previous scenario, where the creep cried "fire" in a crowded theater, many would conclude that this mischief maker caused the resultant damage to person and property. Certainly this person is morally responsible and legally liable for instigating his offense, and it's also true that had this deceptive act not occurred, the havoc would not have happened. This relationship of contingency is the basic idea associated with the word cause. There is no question that the people in the theater were absolutely set up for a losing set of responses. Sometimes life happens just like this false alarm scenario. Life is a setup. But to change your stripes, it is vital to remember that the people in the crowded theater responded according to their personal perception and choice, decisions made according to the kind of creature they are currently. The way each person reacted was not fixed. It was not mechanically caused. Each person could have done things differently if he or she was a different kind of creature. Given the way I define cause herein, the kid who cried "fire" did not technically cause the specific reactions of each person in the theater. Instead, the false alarm directly constrained reactions. This means that the cry of "fire" placed perceptual limits upon the people, and in response, each person made last-minute decisions within misleading and limiting interpretive boundaries according to who they are from the heart, the kind of creature they are from the core. Definitions. A constraint is that meaningful and interpretive impact upon people that tends to narrow and limit a range of responses. Yet the returning response has room to reflect the individual disposition, perception, and choice of the impacted. Constraints apply to beings that can perceive situations in a variety of ways, and then choose variable responses according to their values and rationale. When I use the word meaningful, this is not a synonym for significant. Rather, it signifies meaning-full, or full of meaning. This is the nature of linguistic relations called communication. It is full of meaning, and it also exerts impact. Thus, it is constraining. In contrast, the word cause describes a mechanical interaction between two physical things. A causal impact always produces a necessary outcome, which is a consistent outcome occurring beyond perception and choice. The result of a causal impact is called effect, whereas the answer to a constraint is termed response. Effects are not chosen, whereas responses are always chosen. But there are some responses that flow from us that feel very unchosen. I call them knee-jerk reactions, responses that are not chosen in the moment they appear. While they do flow from us in the now, they were actually chosen in prior days, weeks, and months. The knee-jerk reaction is a type of response that is the cumulative result of a history of choices made previously, choices that set in motion an automatic and unthinking reaction to emerge in the moment. Like landmines, knee-jerk reactions are set to explode in future days, as explodable people are stepped on. Irritating situations are a setup for such explosive people. Again, this means not all human responses are consciously chosen in the moment they appear, but they may burst out of us unthinkingly due to a prior pattern of choices, reactions that squirt out of us unconsciously like a reflex twitch. If you are going to change your stripes, it's supremely important to realize and remember that you are the ultimate author of all your knee-jerk reactions. Each choice you make is like shooting an arrow into the air. It must land somewhere and at some time. Once they are launched, decisions made like arrows shot cannot be called back, and choices, like arrows, will always have a landing consequence. Thus, the knee-jerk reactions that erupt today are the landing consequence of choices that you authored yesterday. See Provocability Quotient, page 48, and Energy in Motion, page 131. My choices are determined by my present disposition. I am not completely free to choose any choice, nor am I free from the consequences of my choosing. Consequences unfold according to governing laws of life. In summary, a cause creates a necessary effect that occurs between physical things, whereas a constraint creates limiting boundaries within which a response is chosen. Causes occur within the physical realm of your world, whereas constraints occur within the behavioral and meaningful realm. The phrase life is a setup means that the world constrains you in every moment. Constraints are all impacts that impinge upon your life. They can be helpful or hurtful. They can encourage or discourage. Constraints intervene within your life as softly as a small pebble tossed into your pool of consciousness, or they may manifest as abrupt impacts that crash into awareness. Constraints can cause you to pay attention for a time, but they do not cause your eventual responses of thought, action, motive, or emotion. Such eventual responses are determined by who you are from your core. While a constraint may cause me to pay attention for a time, it cannot cause my ultimate response. Communicative restraints. Constraints press upon us in the common communications of everyday life. Constraints come in the form of spoken and written expressions and include the full range of nonverbal gestures and actions. Communicative restraints manifest in a meaningful realm, whereas causes occur entirely in a mechanical realm. Again, the word meaningful refers to the interpretive, expressive ways we relate with one another, talking, listening, responding, using both verbal and body language. Human discourse is full of meaning. In daily dialogue, the meaning expressed and the interpretive replies that come in response both create mutually constraining impact upon participants. Communicative constraints may tempt, tease, entice, lure, coax, cajole, or persuade the recipient of a meaningful impact. However, such expressive and influential constraints always fall short of necessary mechanical causation. Constraints may confront you in compelling ways, but you always have interpretive wiggle room to respond variably, and the chosen responses that answer a constraining impact will unavoidably take on the color of the creature being constrained. This means you will act according to the animal you are until you change your stripes and become a new kind of creature. The tone and temper of all reaction and response inevitably depends upon the disposition of the perceiver, the core of your character. This explains why changing your stripes is such a vital project. Your disposition of character is a constraint to obtaining your own best interests in life. It's the old "you are your own worst enemy" dilemma. Even though rhetoric of free to choose runs rampant in pitches of "I'm here to pump you up" and positive mental attitude, still the stark reality remains. People are only partially free to choose. See page 43. Truth is, you can only make choices within the constraints of your current character. Proactive choices and sudden reactions to what happens are both limited by your disposition. Curiously, you are a constraint to yourself. You can be your own worst enemy, or you can change your stripes and be your own best friend and a delight to others. Besides, the barriers you personally bring to a situation via ignorance and incompetence, lack of knowledge, and inability to do, beyond these personal barriers, situational constraints place limits upon perceived and real options, further narrowing your choosable range of responses. But as you become aware of the animal that you are and become more in tune with the realities of our earthly situation, you begin to find freedom within your box of constraint. I begin to think outside the box once I realize I am living in a box of continual constraint. This is my mortal situation. Life is a setup. It mostly doesn't matter whether the constraints that press upon you are real or imagined. W.I. Thomas correctly maintained, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. The Thomas theorem essentially means that perception is reality. But this oversimplified translation misses the mark in a very big way. Independent of perceptual definitions of reality, there are physical realities that stubbornly assert their insistence regardless of how you perceive them. Hubert Blumer, author of Symbolic Interactionism Theory, calls this stubborn physical nature the obdurate reality of the empirical world. The word obdurate means unyielding and obstinate. The tangible aspects of reality can unexpectedly whack you hard in the head. For instance, if perception fails to acknowledge the reality of a low-hanging branch, the tree will tell you of its real existence in a very firm and memorable manner. Ouch! So, perception is not purely all reality. Rather, perception leads to consequences that you experience in reality, and those consequences in turn confirm whether your perceptions of reality were adequate. Our world is both perceptually meaningful and tangibly material. In addition to communicative constraints that influence us within a meaningful world, physical constraints also impact us within a material world. Physical constraints. People are constrained by the realities of a tangible world, the physical presence of both things and other beings. The physical world constrains us by low-hanging branches, jutting rocks, cracks in concrete, etc. Constraints that can trip us up if we're not aware. Every object in sight is a potential influence that shapes how we perceive and what we choose. Swinging doors, slippery floors, dirty walls, bouncing balls, moving cars, or sticky bars. All these and a million more are physical things that shape and constrain the world of human beings. Further, because human beings are embodied, the tangible reality of human bodies is also a constraint to how people perceive and act. Physical constraints occur in both positive and negative ways. They can be pleasant and desirable, or intrusive and unwanted. A desirable kind of constraint occurs when people experience bodily closeness or physical touch, inviting an amicable moment. Conversely, when others crowd space or block paths of entry or escape, Such are examples of unpleasant physical constraint. Our tangible world contains millions of physical things and embodied beings. Thus, mortal life presents a myriad of constraining possibilities. But this discussion of physical constraints centers on human relations, how constraints are perceived and experienced person to person. There is a point at which physical constraint crosses a line to become physical cause. Physical approaches that fall short of forceful bodily contact stay in the category of constraint, when those who are physically constrained can still choose a range of physical responses. Then the dividing line between cause and constraint has not been crossed. On the other hand, when physical force becomes oppressive and overpowering as to inflict effects upon your body beyond perception and choice, this mechanical impact is classified as cause. Cause occurs through physical impact that eliminates options and creates necessary effects to the body of the impacted. In addition to the physical effects of scratches, cuts, bruises, or breaks, physical cause includes forceful contact that pulls or pushes people in unwanted ways, causing effects to body movements. Here's the point. It's crucial to discern the difference between cause versus constraint, because even if physical impacts cause necessary effects to your body or to your body movements, these same physical impacts cannot cause the ultimate movements of your heart and soul. So even though your body may be bound, restricting physical movement, and even though intrusive impacts may break or bruise your body, still responses of heart and soul are never mechanically caused. Instead, they are meaningfully constrained by the same physical impacts that bruise, break, or restrict. For example, if someone were to physically batter your body, this abuse may cause effects to your body, but that same abuse cannot mechanically cause an emotion of hatred within your heart. Effect is a word to describe necessary outcomes. Causes create mechanical effects. Response is a word to describe chosen outcomes. Constraints present real and perceived boundaries to response. Cause and effect occurs mechanically. Constraints invite and invoke responses meaningfully. Given the definitions of cause and constraint herein, causal impact only occurs between physical things, and since the human body is both a physical thing as well as living being, tangible bodies can be necessarily affected by intentional or accidental physical impact. And from the other side of impact, you can cause effects to other tangible things and embodied beings too. Crucial insights that can free people from unnecessary suffering are understood as distinctions are made between cause versus constraint, as well as body versus being. See page 61. How so? Here's one liberating insight. Suffering of soul is a chosen response that manifests meaningfully according to the character of the impacted person, whereas bodily pain is a mechanical and necessary outcome that occurs beyond the choice and perception of the impacted. Again, even if forceful bodily contact occurs and effects to the body are caused, still responses of heart and soul remain constrained. This means suffering of mind and emotion is optional, while bodily pain may be necessary. A correct understanding of the realities of mortality can end unnecessary heartache that is ironically self-inflicted. See page 237. Bodily pain is a necessary effect caused by forceful physical contact, whereas suffering of heart and soul is optional and chosen according to the character of the person impacted within the meaningful boundaries of constraint. When people misunderstand the nature of our human world, such misconceptions can lead to undesirable and unnecessary consequences. That which you perceive as real is real in its consequences. When we begin to perceive distinctions between pain of body versus suffering of soul, as we carefully study and understand differences between human body versus human being, body, being, mind, emotion, action, intention, heart, and soul, all these are descriptive aspects that come together to make up you. But conceptual confusion arises when these aspects are unwisely blurred together into one overgeneralized conception of self. Such overgeneralizing explains why some incorrectly conclude that responses of heart, mind, and emotion are mechanically caused by the same impacts that cause effects to a body. Here's the false logic. It was you that was harmed, and your mind and emotions are part of you, so every part of you must have been affected. This logic is embedded in the implications of words, and false logic like this gives a glimpse into why many misconceive the human condition. because they allow the erroneous applications of words to shape what they imagine reality is. How words constrain and distort perceptions of the world is a very involved topic explained in The Emotional Self. See pages 105 through 125. Thus, there are distinct facets to the human self, and while there is harmony between aspects of who you are, still each facet has its own unique way of manifesting. With a clear understanding of the multiple aspects of the human self, how each aspect functions, you can better understand distinctions between necessary pain and optional suffering. What luck! The aspects of self are explained in Chapter 2. Finally, an important point bears repeating. Even amid outer abuses, inner liberty remains. This is the principle that Viktor Frankl learned while experiencing extreme abuse in Nazi death camps. Inner liberty means that no outward abuse can cause inner responses of heart, mind, and soul. Recall that low-hanging branch that whacked you hard in the head. This intrusive impact may have left a necessary mark that was caused, but thereafter, how you respond to the tree is entirely up to thee. In other words, the way you make meaning about what happened is constrained, not caused. Causal impacts that forcefully harm your body do not also mechanically cause your subsequent responses of mind, motive, or emotion. Discerning the distinctions between cause versus constraint and effect versus response will enhance the process of changing your stripes. The same intrusive impacts that cause effects to my body can only constrain responses of heart, mind, and soul. At the level of being, all impacts that confront me, both physical and communicative, are constraints and never causes. Outer bondage, inner liberty. The dividing line between cause and constraint is illustrated in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. During World War II, Frankl was a prisoner of a Nazi death camp where he witnessed horrific human suffering and abuse. Of his arduous experience, Frankl observed, "If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life. The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. Here lies the chance for a man either to make use of or forego the opportunities of attaining the values that a difficult situation may afford him. In every adversity, there is opportunity, the chance to obtain value and deeper meaning in life. Even under appalling abuse, there is liberty within. You are the ultimate author of your inner responses." Of this liberty, Frankl noted, "Only a few kept their full inner liberty and obtained those values which their suffering afforded. But even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may rise him above his outward fate. Such men are not only in concentration camps. Everywhere man is confronted with fate, with the chance of achieving something through his own suffering." In distinguishing the sometimes subtle line between cause versus constraint, it is crucial to recall the difference between physical effects that are forcefully caused upon a human body, as opposed to the responses that come from your heart, mind, and soul, responses that can only be constrained. Effects caused by physical impact to a physical body occur completely beyond a person's perception and choice, whereas expressions of heart, mind, and soul, though constrained by the same intrusive physical impact, still enjoy what Frankl calls inner liberty. Even as physical injury and pain is caused, you are free to choose responses of heart and soul. You are able to make use of what a difficult situation can teach. Inner liberty is always available. You are ever free to embrace it. Responses of your heart and soul cannot be caused by external impact. The way you express yourself during trying times of life reveals who you are from the heart. As an Old Testament proverb teaches, "If thou faint in the day of adversity, thy strength is small." Character is tested at the edge of adversity. The way you respond when the going gets tough reveals the core of your character. Khalil Gibran recognized that human beings express inner liberty. He not only maintained that we are free to choose love in spite of life's tragedies, but further, we are more able to amplify that love directly because of our tragedies. Gibran taught that the expanded space that pain carves out creates potentials for greater compassion. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Said another way, our pain carves out a larger space for love to fill. Filling the space excavated by pain and suffering with larger amounts of love hits at the heart of what it means to live richly and celebrate life. On the other hand, we are at choice to embrace the opposite aim, for pain carves out a larger space that can also be filled with hateful emotions. Inner liberty is lost as we allow our souls to be poisoned with anger and resentment. By harboring hateful emotions, we become shackled by chains of our own choosing. As we choose contempt instead of compassion, we lose the liberty to enjoy contentment and peace that naturally comes with compassion. By choosing compassion over contempt, embracing positive emotions over poisoned emotions, we become free to enjoy the heights of happiness. Each person decides whether painful trials will be a continuous tormentor or a persistent teacher. Every human being is at liberty to remain bitter or become better. The very afflictions that may enrage us can also enlarge us. Faced with affliction, life perpetually presents two opposing paths: become poisoned by oppression or find opportunity in adversity. By tasting the bitterness of suffering, we learn to appreciate the sweetness of life. In this knowledge of contrasting opposites, we have immense opportunity. But the downward outcome can also be chosen. We can become sour by yielding to self-made misery. Those who choose not to discover that values that a different situation may afford, choosing bitter over better, are destined to retain a sour taste, even when sweetness is abundantly available. What twisted reasoning is held in our heads that makes wallowing in angry emotions the preferred alternative? Why would anyone choose to drag the heavy weight of yesterday's misery into the brightness of a new day? From the oppression of pain arises opportunity. As we keep inner liberty, there awaits the euphoric energies of love and compassion. Our pain carves out a larger space for love to fill. Some who choose the slippery course of contempt and its attendant misery might argue that their particular tragedy is exceptional. They may contend that their abuse is so egregious that getting over it is a mountain too tall to climb. Here's the truth. The severity of a situation does not determine whether we become bitter or better, as Frankl noted. Even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways, in the final analysis it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision and not the result of camp influences alone. How we respond to accident, oppression, or abuse is the result of an inner decision. This is not merely a good-sounding theory, but what Frankl discovered from his arduous experience of suffering. Frankl learned that the ability to make this inner decision is mankind's final freedom. No situation, no matter how terrible or tragic, can keep us from this choice, this freedom. It's not what happens to you in life, but how you respond to what happens that matters most. Oppressive people may compel your flesh, but no power on earth can force you from inner liberty. It is yours to lose or keep. In life, the color and character of your response is all important. The way that you react is a reflection of who you are from your core. Your reactions reveal the depths of heart and soul. Learning to respond well to life's most challenging moments leads to contented living. Who you are from the heart defines whether poisoned or positive emotions will flow from you in a pressing moment. For this reason, changing your stripes is a project of paramount importance. Can you see the intrinsic trap before you? The very condition of your disposition is naturally self-perpetuating. You tend to reinforce who you are today because who you are presently is the one doing the thinking, perceiving, responding, and choosing. This is why people behave in consistent patterns of habit. How can you possibly think fresh new thoughts using your stale old mindset? See page 175. How can you choose compassionate responses when your disposition is not presently compassionate? Breaking out of this self-perpetuating bind requires that you become a new creature from your core, today. The kind of creature that can be calm, patient, and compassionate, even amid compelling constraints of confusion and distress. Becoming the kind of creature that will consistently keep inner liberty is enhanced by understanding responsibility. The division of responsibility. If you want to know what you're made of, watch what comes out of you under pressure. When life squeezes you with trials and troubles, how do you respond? The division of responsibility is drawn. If it comes out of you, it is yours. You are the author of all your responses, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Embracing this principle is empowering, for if you are the ultimate author of your behaviors, motives, and emotions, then you also possess the final veto vote. Otherwise, you're stuck in stale stories of how others or your circumstance is victimizing you. You are the author of your responses. Only when you own responsibility for your actions can you change them. The irritating behavior of others presents a constraint to which you respond, and while that bothersome behavior may necessarily capture your attention, the obnoxious actions of others cannot cause the particular style or character of your response. With the distinction between cause and constraint in mind, recall the scenario of the creep who cried "Fire!" in the crowded theater. All reacted according to the current condition of their disposition. Some people pushed, as opposed to calmly moving out the exits, because of who they are. They reacted according to their individual excitability, the predisposition that they brought with them to the theater before the dunce did his dirty trick. The same self-perpetuating disposition they've been shaping since childhood through a consistent pattern of chosen responses. This means some people are more prone to froth with frenzy when constrained by a pressing event. Such people might be termed frenzy-able. Technically speaking, the scrapes, cuts, and bruises experienced by theater patrons were directly caused by the frenzied people who pushed from behind, not by the bonehead who blurted out the false alarm. This blurting was a constraint. To be clear, cause requires physical connection. So who's responsible for the chaotic tangle that occurred in the hypothetical theater? This question would normally put the average mind into a complex, confusing analysis of cause and effect, to include lots of blame and finger-pointing. The analysis is really quite simple, and answers come clear according to this important principle, the division of responsibility. If it comes out of you, it is yours. Let's agree to put the creep who cried "Fire!" in jail for disturbing the peace and require restitution for damages too. But it would be well for all the frantic and pushing people in the theater to consider changing their stripes and become the kind of creature that can remain calm even amid frenzy and frothing. Because life is a setup. Those who would live life to its fullest will become completely responsible and prepare their character for life's next tough test, because it's on its way, ready or not. While offensive behavior may necessarily capture your attention, the hurtful actions of others cannot cause the character of your response. Who's to blame? In response to the accusing query, "Who's to blame?" I've got two words: wrong question. When you ask a wrong question, you will get a wrong answer. I recall a client who tried to put a percentage to the blame he bore for creating the marital mangle in which he was mired. He figured his contribution was about 66%. Trying to divide blame between relational combatants by percentage, 70-30 or 60-40, etc., may make the lower percentage partner feel better, but in the end, the question of blame is unhelpful. It doesn't practically improve anything. Such thinking simply plays into an excuse-making mentality. I may be bad, but at least I'm not that bad. The best question to ask is, who's responsible? And the answer is everyone. Everyone is able to respond. Hence, everyone is personally responsible for the stuff that they create, including all thoughts, behaviors, motives, and emotions coming out of them. My client was entering into the problem from a poor premise. He was asking the wrong question. Instead of dividing blame between the two marital combatants, I told him that he gets to own 100% of all the problem making and problem perpetuating that is coming out of him, and his wife gets to own 100% of all her problem making and problem perpetuating too. Whatever that is, however each person's mess manifests, be it a lot or a little, whether you are the larger or smaller offender, your way out of the tangle is to own everything that comes out of you. Owning everything means owning all offensiveness, of course, but it also means owning all offendedness too. In the changing your stripes paradigm, we learn that being offended is just as offensive as being offensive. Being offended is simply the response end of bad behavior, while being offensive is the constraint end of bad behavior. Average thinking on this issue maintains that the bad behavior that happened first is badder. One can easily get tangled into a dead-end debate. The offended person will inevitably argue, "But if you had not done this, then I never would have done that." Getting trapped in this mental conundrum will drive you crazy. It will make your head ache. Because life is a setup, you could sing the "I'm offended by your offensiveness" song for the rest of your life. And if you're tempted to hang on to the "but they did it to me first" excuse, then you might as well invoke the ultimate alibi. But if mom hadn't given birth to me, then I wouldn't have yada, yada, yada. With this lousy line of logic, you could blame your parents for every bad thing you've done since birth. It is indeed a fact that if your parents had not brought you into the world, then you would not have done anything bad. But you would not have done anything good either. You just would not have done anything, period. Nevertheless, the hardwired reality of this world is that you were born and that life is a setup. So the quicker you get used to it, get over it, and get on with it, the sooner you'll be changing your stripes and responding in productive patterns of the new creature you are becoming. Life is a setup means that you live in a world of ever-pressing constraints. Learning to own and hone your ability to respond well is at the apex of life's purpose. When you fully embrace this aim of excellence, each pressing constraint is viewed as a test and a teacher, instead of just a tormentor. The difference comes as you see the big picture. You realize the way the world works and accept the reality of the zoo you live in, rather than fight against it. So here you are living life. You can be flexible or you can be miserable. You can celebrate it or you can suffer it. If you want to celebrate life, then you get to accept that life is a setup. And you get to own all responsibility for everything that comes out of you. Always remembering that bad behavior in the first place, the initiating or constraint end, compared to bad behavior in the second place, the receiving or response end, still boils down to bad behavior. Owning your bad, regardless of unfair setups and extenuating circumstances, is a good beginning. The aim of excellence invites us to rise above the level of average and mediocre responses. Anyone can react poorly when mistreated, and most people do, but it takes a person of high character to respond with patience and compassion when mistreated. This kind of excellence is our aim. The first 2 chapters of this book help you understand the given realities of self and situation, where life offers both oppression and opportunity, where who you are can be your own worst enemy or your own best friend. Which of these alternatives you embrace and emphasize will depend upon whether you change your stripes. As you come to know the hardwired realities of who you are and the world in which you live, you will absolutely be more free to live richly. Within the constraints and causes of this world, you get to go from here. 2 types of suffering. Situational suffering. When difficult, distressing, or disastrous events erupt in our lives beyond our control, we may experience what I call situational suffering. This type of suffering is felt in the immediate moments that a tragedy presses directly upon us. It is the primary type of suffering that Frankl and his fellow prisoners experienced while incarcerated in Nazi concentration camps. Situational suffering happens in those direct moments we are the objects of unkindness or abuse. It occurs because of the untimely movements of Mother Nature or challenges due to body ailments, and is also brought about by accidents of mechanical failure or human error. When man-made misfortunes or other adversities cause distress and destruction, one of the things that can be harmed is the human body. Situational suffering means that outside physical impacts may cause effects to the body and inflict necessary suffering, as opposed to suffering that is self-inflicted. But even without physical harm to the body, unprovoked adversity is emotionally hard to bear. While the effects of emotional harm may linger over time, in contrast, emotional anguish need only last as long as the initiating adversity. It can disappear as the distressing event disappears. Seeing tragic events through the lens of life's purpose can help us endure and get over tough times. C.S. Lewis offers insight. I suggest to you that it is because God loves us that he gives us the gift of suffering. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. You see, we are like blocks of stone out of which the sculptor carves the forms of men. The blows of his chisel, which hurt us so much, are what makes us perfect. So in situations where no physical damage is done to a body, most people will still feel emotional distress when faced with verbal or emotional assault, just as distress is physically felt when your body is battered. While much emotional suffering can be directly attributed to a challenging situation, on the other hand, all emotional responses are amplified or diminished by the individual disposition of the impacted. Whether emotional suffering is large or small, when a challenging moment is in the past, there is literally nothing to directly cause further distress but you. This means there is a moment of choice, a point of transition where situational suffering can morph into another type of misery that I call self-inflicted suffering. The transition from situational suffering to self-inflicted suffering commonly goes undetected. When an aggravating event is over and a reasonable amount of time for emotional healing is passed, then from the dawning of a new day, further emotional suffering is optional. It is chosen. When fresh energies of a new day are willfully declined, then distress you experience beyond this point of transition, this junction of choice, becomes suffering that is self-inflicted. The bitter truth for those that amplify and extend situational suffering beyond the point of impact, after the dust of yesterday's difficulties has long been settled, any pain that you retain is self-inflicted. When faced with situational suffering, the importance of inner liberty looms large, for in the face of tragedy beyond your control, you are still at choice to respond with either compassion or contempt. And by choosing contempt, you intrinsically retain unnecessary pain that is no longer initiated by the intrusive event. Instead, future pain is ironically initiated by you, self-made misery. As if the crushing constraints and causes were not enough, you actually inflict yourself further by harboring bitter emotions of contempt. As poisoned emotions flow from you, there are two facts that you get to face. One, if it comes out of you, it is yours. You get to own that you are the author of your bitter emotions. And two, every emotion that is not pure white is a gray shade of emotion that signals your betrayal of truth. See page 196. Self-inflicted suffering. This second category of suffering is termed self-inflicted because it is initiated by choice. It is the suffering of soul that comes in consequence of our failure to keep inner liberty. When people complain of this inner pain, they are not faking it. The anguish they feel is real, and at the same time, it is unnecessary. Recalling the case of Viktor Frankl and other death camp prisoners, even if a situation brings horrific suffering, keeping inner liberty can bring inner peace of soul and heart amid this outward oppression. Self-inflicted suffering is an inner anguish due to our failure to be true. There are bad things that happen and suffering that I experience because of bad situations. Then there are bad things that I do and suffering that I experience because I have not been true. A traumatic event typically explains how suffering started, but that same event can become a person's excuse for not keeping inner liberty. Tough times can be an excuse to remain down. Yet history is replete with examples of how the human spirit rises above circumstance. Thus, the very same situation that may trip us up can be our opportunity to stand taller. Tough times will either be a stumbling block or a building block. They can be our oppression or our opportunity. Within the constraints of each challenging situation, it is you who puts the cause of your life into motion. The determining difference is in you. Our Creator has endowed you with a will to choose. So your destiny is not determined by how intense or terrible the afflicting fate. Rather, the defining factor resides with the being who decides. Why we choose self-made misery. Self-inflicted suffering is most often chosen in connection with past trauma. While an aggravating event may have caused misery back then, after the dust of that difficulty was well settled, we stood at a junction of choice, a point of transition, where the traumatic event that initially caused our suffering now becomes our reason to continue misery. From this junction of choice, the suffering is no longer caused, but it is willfully contrived for a reason. It is chosen because. I experience situational suffering due to causes. In contrast, I experience self-inflicted suffering due to be causes. I stir up self-made misery for reasons. Contriving continued suffering may not be a deliberate decision made in the now, like deciding to buy a pair of shoes at the store. Instead, it's most often an unconscious decision that subtly flows from our disposition. After all, what rational person would intentionally take hold of a big, thick, quote-unquote, misery stick and commence self-flagellation? Thus, we bludgeon ourselves with the cane of pain, and at the same time, we do not think that this is what we are doing. We are deceived. Choosing self-made misery means that I keep bitter waters running even after the inflicting faucet has been shut off, and as the initiating aggravation passes into the past. Self-made misery becomes my ironic alternative of choice, a choice that is made either consciously or unconsciously. Either way, I am the author of this misery. When we unconsciously choose self-made misery in the moment, the actual, deliberate choice to experience this misery was chosen in prior days, months, or years. This means that all unconscious choosing that emerges today came from decision-making energy that was set in motion yesterday. One reason for continuing self-produced pain today is to preserve evidence of being victimized yesterday. Those who invest in victimhood need evidence to bolster credibility for their accusing campaign. Preserving evidence is one of the more conspicuous reasons to continue self-made misery. As pain is self-perpetuated, a paradox appears. Because continued misery is essential evidence in our accusing case, preserving evidence becomes more important than having peace. Since the accusing case against yesterday's offenders depends upon maintaining today's personal pain, strangely, some victims find further suffering advantageous. While there may have been real suffering that was caused by an aggravating event initially, continued suffering gradually becomes psychosomatically contrived by the inertia of an accusing imagination. This means present suffering is neither caused nor constrained by yesterday's adversity. Instead, it's solely caused by an unforgiving heart. Thus, today's proof of yesterday's abuse is conjured evidence, tampered evidenced. Even though self-made misery is initiated by an accusing imagination, again, this does not mean the suffering is imaginary. The suffering is real, but it's also really contrived in its creation, when the choice to let go and stop it could have been made in prior weeks, months, or years. Psychosomatic effects can arise from an agitated, anxious imagination. The Thomas theorem applies. That which you perceive as real is real in its consequences. Hence, bad biology is produced by stinkin' thinkin', the mental machination of a migraine mental block. See page 176. While some misery is inflicted in the moment by others or by accidents, beyond the point of impact, after the dust of a difficulty has long since settled, all further misery is self-inflicted. Seeking support for victimhood. An additional entanglement unfolds. The more time a victim invests into vengeance toward offenders, the more a victim needs to realize a return on that investment. Yet, as time passes and the aggravating event floats downstream into the vast sea of vague memories, it becomes increasingly hard to maintain accusing momentum. It is more difficult to maintain intensity of misery, aka evidence. The longer one hangs on to self-inflicted suffering, the more one's accusing story must parallel the intensity of today's claimed misery. This means yesterday's purported offensiveness must be proportionate to today's offendedness. If yesterday's offensiveness is not sufficiently appalling to justify the intensity of today's offendedness, then those hanging on to this version of victimhood are tempted to embellish and amplify the nature of the initial offense. In other words, the victim needs to make yesterday's abuse bigger than it really was to justify today's bigger claim of emotional pain. Thus, a justifying story is contrived by a victim to enroll sympathy from an audience of observers. When I use the word justify, I'm not suggesting that this type of justification is genuine. Exactly the opposite. We will learn that justifying is a telltale sign of inner imbalance. See pages 173 and 177. People who wrestle with inner turmoil have a heightened need to appear justified in the eyes of observers. Thus, they concoct a plausible story that's as big as the pain they claim. So this is the paradoxical position we twist our way into. We're whacking ourselves with the misery stick, but we contrive a story to explain why we're not really hitting ourselves in the head and why someone else or something else is causing this misery. Attempts to outwardly justify are only needed by those who feel inwardly unjustified. Said another way, if you have to try to convince yourself, that means you're not convinced. Those who feel insecure will seek security through various means of convincing, first themselves and then others. Vote getting. The saying goes, time heals all wounds, but in the case of a person prolonging self-produced pain, the opposite adage applies. Time wounds all heals, Heels. Instead of relishing in the relief that time brings after the initial source of suffering has ceased, instead of letting go of it, getting over it, and getting on with it, some victims use time to continue their accusing case and search for every piece of evidence to embellish, exaggerate, and add to their justifying story, a contrived production of emotion and manipulation aimed at securing votes. People who are truly justified in their thoughts, words, and deeds enjoy inner peace. Therefore, they do not seek outward approval or campaign for popular votes because they have no use for them. In contrast, people who prolong self-produced pain do so for the benefit of an outside audience from whom they wish to get votes and outward validation. People who are inwardly unsettled seek the supportive votes of others, precisely because they don't have the only vote that counts, the vote of inward validation. When a person's life is in harmony, lobbying for lesser votes is not needed because the only vote that counts is already secured. Those who anxiously need popular votes and fretfully seek popular votes will also tend to maintain self-made misery because it is useful for gleaning sympathy through the vote-getting process. But just how long might a person hang on to this continuing campaign of victimhood and vote-getting? Resentment retention time. When a person is offended, about how long should that person continue to feel hurt or humiliated thereafter? This is the question of resentment retention time, a question that gives priority to politically correct popular votes over being true to the heart. Consider this scenario. A person says they are upset at being insulted, and observers ask, "What was the insult that brought on this dire distress?" The offended one answers, "That ill-mannered ignoramus blurted out in front of everyone that I was having a bad hair day." Now, let's locate this insulting event upon the resentment retention time continuum. How long should a person feel insulted for being accused of having unruly hair? Just how long should the pain be retained? 2 minutes? 2 hours? 2 days? 2 weeks? 2 months? 2 years? 2 decades? Sane thinkers would not deem this insult egregious enough to warrant 2 weeks' worth of resentment. The trauma is simply not terrible enough. But you'd be amazed at how some people hang on to oversized resentment for undersized offenses. In this situation, the oppressive insult may warrant being bent out of shape for about 2 hours or 2 days tops. But as the silly insult remains stuck in the hypothetical craw, and this victim wants to prolong a claim of suffering, then the offended person needs a bigger story to justify larger suffering, even though the insulting event was small. If resentment retention time is extended, the claim of personal pain needs to be proportionate to the purported oppression, especially in the minds of observers who will be called upon for a vote of sympathy and support. Wanting votes and seeking votes doesn't always mean that you will get those votes. And if you can't win the popular vote with an accurate portrayal of the insulting event, then you might be persuaded, even by a blame-biased society, to let it go. The opposite alternative is to engage in story stretching, a tactic used commonly in vote-getting campaigns. After the politically correct resentment retention time has expired, victims stand at a point of transition, let it go and move on to bigger and better horizons, or engage in story stretching. To justify a longer RRT, the offended person must necessarily stretch the story. Of course, story stretching is a softer way to say lying. But once the adrenaline of selfishness is kicked in, what really happened back then is secondary to the purposes of today's accusing crusade. So the insulted person searches the past for dirty details that can be found or plausibly invented to beef up the stretched story. Lie. Even worse, offenses thought to be forgiven and forgotten are soon resurrected and added to the stretched story, or lie. Curiously, this means that blaming others and harboring resentment have become more important than personal peace. And here's an intriguing twist. The willful act of harboring resentful emotions about yesterday's offenses is today's self-made misery. Besides maintaining evidence that may bring more popular votes, an additional explanation for why people choose the paradoxical pursuit of self-inflicted suffering is this. They don't really think that they are doing it. They don't believe they are choosing self-made misery, and they don't see themselves as trying to be victims. They simply see themselves as victims. Truth is, we are all victimized in this life, for life is a setup. Everyone falls victim to unfair accidents or abuse. Everyone experiences their share of situational suffering. But here's the burning question. Who is going to hang on to suffering after the point of transition, when the dust of a difficulty has long since settled. The person who hangs on to resentment far into the future becomes a self-made victim, which is an oxymoron. The very definition of victim means someone has done it to me, thus someone else is responsible for my pain. This is where such reasoning can go wrong, because there are actually two types of pain to be claimed according to the twofold nature of being human: body and being. See page 61. While you may be a victim of body, physical injury, you can never be a victim of being without your consent. It is true that perpetrators initiate a chain of subsequent actions and reactions. Like the creep that cried fire in a crowded theater, similarly abusive actions set up the abused to respond as poorly or as well as current character is capable. If a person's character needs growth, an abusive setup can be a productive test and teacher, or the opposite alternative is possible. Needless torment will continue over time. The division of responsibility principle maintains that perpetrators are directly responsible for enacting their abhorrent behaviors, and when physical contact occurs, offenders are also responsible for intrusions and abrasions to the body. Nevertheless, everyone, including victims, get to own responses of mind, motive, emotion, and action, all responses of being. See pages 61 through 64. We get to own all responses that come from us, except effects caused to the body. While we don't take responsibility for effects of abuse caused to the body, we must still patiently suffer through those unwanted effects. That's life. Every victim eventually comes to a junction of choice to continue misery or embrace inner liberty. For victims to escape self-inflicted suffering of soul, they must fully accept the fact that resentment is an emotion originating from me, and own that they are the authors of every anguished emotion. Beyond necessary physical pain felt in the body due to accident or abuse, the resentment that a victim harbors is that person's primary suffering of soul. Resentment is unsettled anguish that's chosen and expressed in your being. Self-inflicted suffering comes from my failure to honor my own sense of truth, my inability to hear and heed the whisperings of my heart, my inability to keep inner liberty. When people actively participate in the willful creation of anguished emotions, but then deny their participation, this is a condition I call fooling yourself. It also goes by other names. Jesus called it blinded. Freud used the term in denial. C. Terry Warner describes it as self-deceived, and common folks call it deluded. See Einstein's Mind Bind, page 175, and Blindness of Mind, page 192. Since it makes no sense to consciously make yourself miserable when people do a dance of self-deception, they really are blind to a clear picture of their self-flagellation. Here's the truth. After the dust of a difficulty has settled, and people paradoxically choose self-inflicted suffering, their inner anguish continues due to failure to keep inner liberty, and not because of the aggravating event that has passed into the past. As I speak of the dust of a difficulty settling, I acknowledge that there is little relief for some victims until after direct assaults of abuse or oppression have completely ceased. Yet a person need not wait for adversity to end, for inner liberty can be chosen today. I need not wait for the dust of a difficulty to settle. I can embrace inner liberty immediately, even amid an aggravating event. Keeping inner liberty while in the midst of a trauma doesn't mean that all pain disappears, but it does mean that self-inflicted suffering is not added to and heaped upon the distress caused by a difficult situation. In other words, one need not feel suffering of the soul, even when physical pain is present. An example of inward peace amid severe outward affliction is given in the account of Christ's crucifixion. Though racked with the extreme physical pain of having nails driven through his hands and feet, yet Christ's thoughts were not consumed by bitterness. He extended compassion to the very people who had crucified him, and had the loving presence of mind to comfort his mother. Experiencing outward affliction that may cause physical pain while still feeling inward peace is a possibility taught by the Apostle Paul. For all things are for your sakes, for which cause we faint not. But though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 15 through 18. Viktor Frankl and his fellow inmates went through a long, hellish ordeal that was hard to bear. Such is the nature of situational suffering, and such is the nature of living in a world where life is a setup. Understanding the twofold nature of being human, explained in Chapter 2, helps you see full responsibility. You are not always responsible for abrasions and abuses that happen to your human body, but at the level of human being, the division of responsibility fully applies. If it comes out of you, it is yours. The condition of your character is revealed by how you respond to tough times, namely, chosen responses of heart, mind, and soul. Everything happens for a reason. Situational suffering means that bad things can happen completely without any bad input from you. Conversely, self-inflicted suffering means you bring suffering upon yourself directly because of your own bad input. This is the given reality of human life. You are capable of making choices that go against yourself, decisions that betray inner harmony, choices that mess up outer relationships, decisions that grind against your best destiny. Human beings are capable of making miserable, dumb decisions. Because we don't like to appear wrong, incompetent, or stupid, when making dumb decisions, most people tend to rationalize a winning image. They defend a superficial facade that I call the self as advertised. See page 98. Once a person has invested much time and energy into a personal ad campaign that sells a certain self-image to others, that person is prone to protect the advertising investment. Openly owning dumb decisions often means going against the purposes of our published promotions. Thus, admitting to mistakes means exposing our stupidity. Since most people do not want to appear as stupid when they really have been stupid, people seek plausible excuses. Instead of owning mistakes, bungling behaviors are rationalized away through a very common disclaimer. Everything happens for a reason. In the name of destiny, this oft-invoked axiom provides you with a rationalizing release from owning responsibility when owning your bungle is exactly what destiny had in mind. Bob came to me in the midst of crisis. His wife had just filed for divorce. He told me that he wanted to remain in the marriage, but his wife was finished with trying to salvage an unsatisfying relationship. He mused aloud during one session, "I wonder why this had to happen." I asked, "What do you mean?" Bob continued, "Well, since everything happens for a reason and there are no accidents in life, I'm wondering about the reason my marriage had to end." Bob was looking for a reason, with a capital R, that resided in divine destiny. In contrast, I could easily see a reason, with a lowercase r, that was far less lofty. Bob was being a bumbling buffoon, and worse, he was oblivious to his buffoonery. Bob was talking as if his marital demise was meant to be, that fate had foreordained this divorce. I asked Bob if I could be blunt, and he consented. I told him, "You got dirt instead of a dessert, and the most compelling reason is you made some dumb decisions." Lurking beneath the seemingly innocuous phrase, "everything happens for a reason," is a crucial philosophical question about fate versus free will. Many are schizophrenic on this issue. On the one hand, they eagerly agree that we are free to choose, while on the other hand, they paradoxically pursue an irresistible itch to have their cards read, palms perused, horoscopes scoped, or to have some soothsayer psych them out about a future that is falsely assumed to be set in the stars. The idea that everything happens for a reason implies that life is largely driven by forces of fate. Therefore, things happen for a reason with a capital R, and people are just passive passengers going along for a predestined ride. So when unexpected or unwanted earthly episodes occur, we wonder, what is the reason this happened? While many things do happen with inspired serendipity, still some decisions are simply uninspired, irrational, or just plain evil, and such decisions can lead to accidental or intentional outcomes that are very unreasonable. The direct explanation for so many of life's unwanted twists and turns is not necessarily because of some higher reason, but most often because unreasonable people are capable of making unreasonable choices, and those lower decisions in turn set in motion unreasonable results. The reality of living in a world of free will is that chaos and confusion can be chosen over calm and clarity. Even barring evil intentions, people are still free to make inept, awkward, and dopey decisions. Accordingly, from chaos, or just clumsy, comes consequences that can be unreasonable. In this life, some things really do happen for no good reason at all. Awkward, unintended, and unfortunate accidents actually do happen because of human error or mechanical failure. The idea that there are no accidents is a contradiction to the realities of God-given free will and self-responsibility. When people incorrectly conclude that everything happens for a reason, it follows that a trainload of undoubtedly dopey decisions were really meant to be and written in the stars. Reality check. Many awful outcomes occur by accident or by evil intent and do not happen for a good reason, in terms of how the misfortune was initiated or set up. Still, hordes of dopey decision makers assume that they are released from personal responsibility because of divine destiny. A higher reason had to happen. It was set in the stars. Truth is, higher reasons unfold directly because people willingly fulfill inspired responsibility to be messengers and servants, as opposed to passive puppets. News alert! The Holocaust and 9/11 did not have to happen, and neither did a million other man-made tragedies. When things happen for no reasonable reason, in time there can be lessons learned. Much wisdom and growth of character is gleaned from the rubble of unreasonable and senseless situations. Life is a setup precisely because people can express their free will to choose actions of incompetence or premeditated evil. Our freedom to choose exists by divine design. Life's highest reasons are realized by learning to respond with patience and compassion in the face of unfair accidents and intentional abuses. When life hands you a lemon, the potential for making lemonade appears. In the face of tough times, you always have the choice to either be a lemon sucker or a lemonade maker. You are free to be bitter or to become better. Even amid devastating decisions that did not have to happen, but did happen, still something good can be salvaged from the rubble of trouble, and that good is manifest best in growth of character. In time, Bob quit thinking that his sad situation was meant to be and written in the stars. He eventually accepted his responsibility and thoughtfully examined the poor choices he made that set in motion his wife's response to want to leave the marriage. Bob reflected upon the dumb decisions that ultimately delivered dirt instead of dessert. If you want to know what you're sending out, see what's coming back. Certainly, Bob's wife bears complete responsibility for all the bad behaviors that came out of her. But regardless of his wife's decisions and actions, Bob could only directly control his own behavior. And since he was the one I was talking to, not his wife, Bob was encouraged to receive his invitation to responsibility. The goal within your control is to become loving and true. We are beings capable of choosing between options of good and evil. The power is in us to express ourselves both creatively and morally in response to what happens. Shakespeare alluded to this truth with these words: "Sometimes men are the masters of fate. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." Now, if you accept this reality of life, then yahoo! That is fantastic news. As you own responsibility for choices that dragged you down the drain, then you can unchoose your way right back out of the sewer. Still, there is a force of destiny that does supply inspired serendipity, but that sweet serendipity is manifest as constraint and never cause. Amid the intervening influences of an infinitely loving creator, human beings remain at choice to flow with or go against a destiny of divine design. While winds of fate are gently blowing, we bear responsibility to set our sails to catch those winds, or not. In the end, I invited Bob to pick himself up, admit the choices he made that helped create his sad situation, and own all the dumb decisions that constrained his wife to decide that divorce was the cure she preferred. With the wisdom that hindsight is willing to teach, Bob saw how he set up the downfall of his marriage, and he learned that the destiny of his marriage was not in the stars, but in his hands. Life is self-correcting. Even though Bob did not get what he personally wanted, to remain married to his wife, he did get exactly what he needed for his growth of character. Life naturally supplies consequences that teach us precisely what we need to become healthy, happy humans. And those self-correcting consequences come in the form of 1. Feedback from others, and 2. Feedback from our feelings. How others respond to us reflects what's going on with us and informs us how we might adjust and reorder our actions. The other self-correcting clue is found in our feelings, specifically our lack of inner peace. When we are not being true to innate intuitions of truth, we will sense this by the loss of emotional harmony. Through our own conflicted feelings, life sends a clear clue to correct our course. Life is self-correcting. Whenever you make a mistake, life will make sure you are properly notified. Life will kick your butt until you get a clue that you are not doing life right. Life will consistently let you know when you're off track. Life will prompt appropriate adjustments and invite inspired serendipity. Life is self-correcting means that when you do bad, you feel bad. Conversely, when you do good, you feel good. When you feel good, life is saying, this works. Keep doing what you're doing. Caring for the health of your heart and soul is much like caring for the health of your body. In taking care of your body, you must listen to built-in biological signs designed to protect the body and maintain proper functioning. For instance, bodily pain is a signal for you to slow down or stop moving certain muscles. In this way, pain leads you back to healing. Similarly, the pain felt in your soul is a signal that adjustment is needed. But pain of body and anguish of soul are two very different things. One is felt mostly beyond your perception and choice, bodily pain, and the other occurs directly because of your perception and choice, suffering of soul. Even so, both kinds of pain are helpful as we listen to self-correcting signals. After the dust of a difficulty has long since settled, further sadness of soul is my clue that I have not been true. When you don't do life right, life doesn't do you right either. Uncomfortable consequences are a clue that you have not been true. Through bitter consequences, you get from life exactly what you need for your best growth. So, as afflictions befall you, life is doing you precisely right. Through the responses coming back from others and the signals of your own anguished emotions, life reveals every flaw that needs improvement. The true principle that life is self-correcting means that humans inherently know how to fulfill the measure of their creation, according to the Creator's divine design. What goes around comes around. In life, self-correcting adjustments happen through the law of the harvest. When you sow good seeds, you reap a harvest of goodness. Like planting good seeds, doing good deeds eventually leads to a harvest of good fruit. In some way and in some form, always. On the other hand, sowing the seeds of dark deeds eventually leads to defective fruits of outward contention and inward commotion. In time I will receive according to what I send out, in direct proportion to the goodness I have given or the darkness I have done. Life will bring all things into balance, harmony, and justice. What goes around eventually comes around. The wise will watch what they send out to others because it's coming back sooner or later. In Eastern philosophy, this truth is called karma, which essentially means that all negative or positive thoughts or actions maintain their initial energy until that energy returns to the originator. The question arises, if life returns to me according to the good seeds I sow, and I'm presently sowing good seeds, then why are bad things happening to me today? The answer comes in the hardwired realities of your mortal situation, the given nature of the zoo you live in. Being human means living in a world where people can choose to do good or evil. Life is a setup. Further, 5 basic sources supply cause and constraint to your personal path, impacts that may bring bad or even when you're being good. 1. Accidents due to human error. 2. Consequences of mechanical failure. 3. Inconsiderate or abusive acts of others. 4. Untimely movements of Mother Nature. 5. Challenges due to ailments of the body. This is the way the world works. Bad things happen beyond your control, and thus you are set up for heartache and frustration. Welcome to Earth. Get used to it, get over it, and get on with it. With gusto. Life is your test and your teacher. You get to eat the cookies with the crackers. Both pleasure and pain have lessons to teach. Listening to life's self-correcting lessons and making the appropriate changes will naturally lead to joyful living. Enduring trials and troubles is the classroom of character development, designed by an infinitely wise creator. It is a constraining context within which human beings may fully develop the single possession that you can take with you after the mortal body returns to dust and the spirit self returns to its heavenly home. Earth life is designed for the perfecting of character. The words of Neil A. Maxwell offer insight. Endurance involves much more than just putting up with a situation. Patient endurance is more than pacing up and down within the cell of circumstance. True enduring represents not merely the passage of time, but the passage of soul. In the end, fulfillment of life's highest purpose is not determined by what happens to you, but by how you respond to what happens to you. How you handle hardships reveals the very core of your character, and thus offers the chance to take inventory and improve. Free to choose. Not really. So given the nature of a self-correcting world, and in light of the law of the harvest, let's grab with gusto the good stuff. But here's the problem. You can't grab the good stuff with gusto if that emphatic energy is not in you. Legendary trumpet player Louis Armstrong said it this way: if you ain't got it in ya, you can't blow it out. You can only choose, and you will only choose, those options you presently feel to choose according to the current condition of your disposition. So you will choose gusto or something less than gusto because of the animal you are. Just like a tiger will always be a tiger and act like a tiger until that tiger becomes a new kind of creature, you will also be who you are until you change your stripes. The oversimplified idea that there is a world full of thrilling alternatives that await your choice is a popular doctrine preached by a glut of self-help gurus. The alluring pitch goes like this: you can create your own reality. You can reinvent yourself according to your wildest whim. Of course, the magic that makes it all happen is supposedly through the marvels of mind power. Even though the rhetoric is enticing, a human being's ability to choose freely is exaggerated by purveyors of positive thinking. Sorry to burst your bubble, but let me break it to you gently. You are not free to choose. Of course you do have some freedom, but in order to have complete freedom of choice, you need to possess two itty-bitty teeny-weeny things. 1, knowledge of all alternatives, and 2, the power or ability to enact any alternative that you know. Ever heard the words omniscient and omnipotent? These two words do not describe you, and they don't describe me or anyone else on earth either. So here are the facts we all get to face. Fact: there is a world full of alternatives, opportunities, and choices out there, and we possess an awareness of only a small fraction of the whole. As we are not aware of certain alternatives, we are not free to choose them. Fact: even if we become aware of more alternatives, we may not presently be empowered to enact many of them, let alone all of them. If we don't have the ability to enact them, then we are not free to do them, hence not free to choose them in the fullest sense of freedom. As to knowledge, we can only choose alternatives that are available to our awareness. As to power, we can only attain alternatives that we are capable of doing. Therefore, until we become more informed and more capable, we remain shackled by our ignorance and inability. Let me illustrate. While you may not be free to play the piano today, you are free to begin piano lessons today, unless money to pay a piano teacher restricts your freedom. Anyhow, let's hire a hypothetical piano teacher and pay them with imaginary money. With some practice and in time, you may be free to play a simple tune like Chopsticks, but without many months of persistent practice, you may not be immediately free to play, for instance, the Minute Waltz by Chopin. One of thousands of intermediate pieces you may not be free to play today. The Minute Waltz is more difficult music upon which you'll need to keep working. Thus, playing the Minute Waltz, especially within 60 seconds, is something you are not free to choose right now. Let's summarize the boundaries of your limitations. You are not free to play advanced music or perform with the proficiency of a concert pianist, yet you are free to keep improving your capabilities line upon line, one step at a time. By the way, Dr. Matt is actually free to play the Minute Waltz by Chopin, but he is not free to play it without some clinkers, and is only capable of playing it in about 1 minute and 45 seconds. Therefore, not free to play the Minute Waltz in a minute. Pertaining to piano playing, your freedom and my freedom is likely limited. Human beings are likewise limited in a million worldly ways, but especially limited in our understanding and ability as to things that matter most in life. To play the pleasing music of highly accomplished character, to sing the joyful melody of absolute integrity. Generally speaking, human beings are often not free to be patient in all situations with all people. Like Chopsticks, you might be able to play the simple music of patience in the presence of peaceful people in pleasant places, but making the harmonious music of being gracious and kind in the midst of a pressing moment, performing this musical score may be beyond your current capacity of character. This more difficult music may be something that you are not free to play today. Choosing and doing the things that matter most is particularly limiting because choosing a change in character is not as simple as picking out a new pair of shoes. You can't just toss integrity and character into a shopping cart and possess them with the swipe of a credit card. The simplistic notion that human beings are free to make any choice in any situation is simply false. Everyone is limited in awareness of alternatives and the ability to enact options, even when aware. The exercise of human choice is ever limited. limited by situational constraints that come in a myriad of varieties and intensities, but most importantly, human choice is limited by who we are. Our freedom is immediately constrained by the present progress of personal character, a character that hasn't yet learned to play, in a most pleasing way, the most magnificent music of life. The good news is that you are free to commence character development lessons today. You are free to make a commitment to the process of changing your stripes. In terms of integrity and character, we all have a long way to go before we get to where we need to be, but we can begin by facing the right direction, now. And in a single moment, we are immediately better than before. The trick is to keep facing that good direction, and then keep moving forward one step at a time, line upon line. Ascending lofty mountaintops may be exhilarating and motivating, but it is the faithful and unfaltering trek through gloomy valleys that is expanding and maturing. Making the beautiful music of proactive patience and love is not a matter of making strategic, calculated decisions. Instead, the sweetest music of life rings out by making simple, sincere decisions. Character is not forged through a determined force of mental will. Rather, character comes forth naturally through a release of will, a yielding to the inherent intuitions of the heart. Integrity is not attained through cleverly conjured techniques or by perfecting outward appearances that look like integrity at the surface. Instead, pure integrity emerges from the depths of your soul as you recover the innocence that was inherently in you as a child, a returning to the simple ways that spontaneously flowed from you in your youth. Because pure integrity is who you are from your beginnings, you don't need to learn integrity. You need to recover it. When you are true, integrity will flow from you. Making the beautiful music of being consistently loving and patient is a function of who you are today, but the only choosable options available to you today are the ones that flow from your present disposition. If you are not presently a patient person, then patience will not flow from you today. This means that you and I cannot choose to play the most magnificent music of life until we recapture who we are from our beginnings, until we recover our original childlike innocence. Burning question: how far from recovering this innocence are we? The gap between who we are now and being purely loving and patient is measured by what I call the PQ, the provoke ability quotient. Provoke ability quotient. What's your PQ? Just as IQ measures intelligence, the PQ represents a person's propensity to be provoked. On a scale from 0 to 10, higher scores indicate the tendency to be quickly and easily inflamed. A score of 10 describes a maniacal rageaholic, and lower scores reflect a propensity for being patient when provoked. Jesus would have a PQ score of 0, and the rest of us would score somewhere between 1 and 10. You've likely heard the terms reaching a breaking point or hitting hot buttons. These words describe the threshold at which we literally cease to have character capacity sufficient to choose a patient reply. Once people pass this breaking point, choosing rationality doesn't really happen. Instead, patterns of reaction are automatic due to an entrenched history of previous choices. Notice I didn't say an entrenched history of social influence. In the pressing moment when the PQ threshold is breached, your exercise of will ceases to be free will. Instead, you are chained to emotional and behavioral consequences that are intrinsically tied to choices made in prior days. It's karma calling to kick your butt. PQ explains the human tendency of knee-jerk reactions, aka going nuts, flipping out, boiling over, blowing up, blowing your top, blowing your cool, acting wacko, going berserk, in a tiff, in a tizzy, losing it, or road raging, etc. Because these reactions are not consciously chosen in the moment they appear, but flow from us quite unconsciously, thus it's commonly assumed that an unconscious mind controls such unconscious behaviors. This is how the false notion of an unconscious mind was hatched. The only mind human beings have is the one that they experience consciously. It's your conscious mind that puts in motion the knee-jerk behaviors that squirt out of you, precisely because of the prior patterns of conscious choosing. The breaking point I call the PQ threshold can also be visualized as a squirting point. If you squeeze a lemon long enough and hard enough, the lemon will spontaneously squirt at a point of external stress. Changing your stripes means becoming the kind of creature that has a low propensity for squirting. The person who has a high PQ is unlikely to choose a loving response when confronted with a pressing situation. High PQ people tend to retaliate with mean emotions Yet they like to blame their berserk behaviors upon those who provided the first provocation. See page 21. High PQ people like singing the classic hit, that solid gold excuse, I wouldn't have done this if you hadn't have done that. When you fully understand the PQ principle, then you will change your tune too. If I didn't have such a high PQ, then I wouldn't have done this, even if you did do that. The reality of PQ explains why most thoughtless crimes of passion are committed. Indeed, they are completely thoughtless because they flow unconsciously from who we are. But here's the catch that many don't get. While a person may act insane in a particular moment of passion, that person is still responsible for the history of choices that produce the propensity to react insanely. The PQ principle helps us understand that those who commit crimes of passion remain responsible and accountable for their disposition of reaction. While people acting wacko may not have consciously chosen an insane act in the moment, they did choose the disposition from which their insanity squirts. See Emotion as Energy in Motion, page 131. One conscious choice at a time, we all choose the kind of creature we become. This means we choose our PQs. From the fountain of who we are flows our knee-jerk reactions that we regret in retrospect. But we remain responsible for the fountain that we are and the behavior that flows therefrom. One conscious choice at a time, you choose your propensity to be provoked. You even choose your propensity to insanity. You are responsible for the person that you become. You are responsible for both your premeditated acts and the thoughtless reactions that flow from you. The division of responsibility principle maintains, if it comes out of you, it is yours. Thus, hateful and mean emotions that come from a perpetrator belong completely to each perpetrator. But some people don't apply this responsibility principle to victims. So when hateful and mean emotions squirt out of victims of abuse in efforts to sympathize and support, the ironic retaliations perpetrated by victims are often excused and justified. Yet, if peace and closure would bless all afflicted souls, victims must cease drinking the same hateful brew that poisons perpetrators. Not wanting to own their venomous reactions, victims will also sing the familiar strains of, I wouldn't have done this if you hadn't have done that. So the same principle applies to perpetrators and victims alike. If I didn't have such a high PQ, then I wouldn't have done this, even if you did that. Perpetrators need not remain prisoners of mean, aggressive tendencies, but neither should victims be prisoners of poisoned emotions in response to accidental or abusive intrusions. Both perpetrators and victims get to put their feet upon the path of recovery. It is overly obvious that offenders need to change their stripes, but it is less obvious and much less accepted that victims who harbor hateful emotions need to change their stripes too. Life is a setup. There will be tough times for all. That's life. Here's the bitter truth. The emotional torment that victims feel years after an abusive event occurred is directly explained by the poisoned emotions generated by the victim. After the dust of a difficulty is well settled, there is a junction of choice and point of transition where more misery becomes self-made. Harboring hateful emotions is the self-inflicting venom that poisons peace. When hateful emotions flow from a victim, this inner bitterness is the responsibility of the victim. The reason why some victims harbor hateful, mean emotions is directly explained by each person's PQ, their provocability quotient. Even if the object of hate is Hitler, emotionally healthy people will not waste precious energy on hating him or anyone else, because that negative emotional energy is the venom that poisons personal peace. Time heals all wounds. As the bright sun rises upon a new day, there is an opportunity for all to recover and renew from the mistakes, offenses, and abuses of yesterday. It is said that time heals all wounds, yet there is another possibility that flows from free will, which is time wounds all heals. Definition of heal equals a hateful person. With the same passage of time, there are two alternatives before us. 1. Recover and renew, or 2. Rationalize and resent. The former brings fresh feelings and new life. The latter drags along continued misery. We live in a culture that justifies and encourages contentious retribution. Choosing rancor and retaliation simply keeps us mired in poisoned emotions, whereas the remedy of recovery and renewal brings peace. The course of recovery means extending forgiveness to those who offend. Yet forgiveness does not mean that offenders escape the consequences of their abusive acts. For the long-term benefit of offenders, the choice to recover and renew can include seeking justice through appropriate channels. Such justice will be guided by promptings of heart and not by impulses of hate or urges of a rationalizing head. Choosing the resentful option is like willfully taking hold of a rope tied to dreary, depressing details of the past and then dragging along this heavy and useless load. Reality check. Who's holding the rope? A song by the Eagles offers advice about hanging on to emotional baggage. Get over it. I turn on the tube and what do I see? A whole lot of people crying. Don't blame me. They point their crooked little fingers at everybody else, spend all their time feeling sorry for themselves. A victim of this, a victim of that. Your mama's too thin and your daddy's too fat. Get over it. Get over it. All this whining and crying and pitching a fit. Get over it. It's like going to confession every time I hear you speak. You're making the most of your losing streak. Some call it sick, but I call it weak. You drag it around like a ball and chain. You wallow in the guilt. You wallow in the pain. You wave it like a flag. You wear it like a crown. Got your mind in the gutter, bringing everybody down. Complain about the present and blame it on the past. I'd like to find your inner child and kick its little... Get over it. Get over it. All this blaming and moaning and pitching a fit. Get over it. It's got to stop sometime. So why don't you quit? Get over it. Get over it. To get over it, you can start by letting go of it, letting go of the rope that ties you to yesterday's misery. Recalling the PQ principle and the fact about free will, it's not as free as you think. Getting over it is not as simple as letting go. It's not as easy as choosing it. How so? Unless you become a let-it-go-able kind of creature, you will not be able to apply the get-over-it admonition. You will not be free to make the sweet music of high-character compositions. See page 46. This means you must first change your stripes and recover the true you. To get over it, you will need to experience a recovery and renewal of who you are from your beginnings. For now, you may be a can't let go of the rope kind of creature, and literally cannot choose the let go of it option. You may be a heel, H-E-E-L, who needs to be healed, H-E-A-L. Time can be used in service of two opposing options. I can seek recovery and renewal and be healed, or I can continue to rationalize and resent and remain a heel, H-E-E-L. Human doings are co-authored. Just as the idea of free will is often overstated, I've probably overstated the division of responsibility principle a little bit. Well, maybe a lot. The truth is that all external behavior is actually co-authored. In other words, what comes out of you at the level of external doings and sayings is absolutely explained by the words, behaviors, and events that occurred before you responded to them. This is the mutually responsive conversation of life that is incorrectly assumed to be a causal chain. But there is an element of truth to this notion, and there is also one big exception. First, the element of truth. Apart from morally loaded aspects of human being, see Inescapable Impact Always on page 83, the outward physical choreographies and verbal statements that come from each of us are a function of a dialogical dance with other people primarily and with all things and beings within our world. In other words, all human doings reflect what circumstances and or people are asking of us in the mildest sense, requiring of us in a stronger sense, or oppressively coercing upon us in the strongest sense. Life is a setup. Situations inherently constrain. Here's an example on the milder end of constraint. If a person calls you on the phone and you respond with the outward choreography of picking up, your act of answering the phone is explained by the telephone ringing, a ring that was initiated and caused by the person calling. Burning question, why did you answer the phone? Answer, because it was ringing. Answering phones that ring is what normal people do. The cause of you answering the phone is not a necessary or mechanical hard cause, as in one thing physically impacting another thing. Rather, it's a kind of soft cause that I call sufficient cause, or B cause. A B cause is a reason why you respond as you do when confronted by a given constraint. When answering a ringing phone, your behavioral movements are not necessary. They are voluntary. You move and respond for a reason. You pick up a phone call because it makes sense to do so. Variable B causes happen within a communicative and meaningful realm. Necessary causes occur in a physical and mechanical realm. Back to the phone conversation. As you converse with your friend, an appointment is set for Monday at 2:30 p.m. When Monday rolls around, you are ready to follow through with that appointment. Your response of readiness is explained by the fact that another person constrained and thus co-authored your expectation of meeting. Your readiness is explained by both the outward constraint and your personal character. You tend to follow through with your word. Accountability for being is individual. As daily interactions unfold back and forth within a dialogical dance, people do things directly because others and situations may invite, require, or coerce certain outward bodily behaviors and verbal statements from them. Hence, these mutually responsive dialogues and deeds are directly explained by the constraints that precede them, co-authored responses of doing that are not necessarily morally loaded. Now for the big exception to the causal chain assumption. What is not a direct effect of situational constraints is the inward emotional tone and intention with which you say your words and do your deeds. The emotional tone that flows from you is always a response explained by your disposition of character, a response for which you are solely accountable, and a response of being that is always morally loaded. Responses of being are a direct function of personal character, or lack thereof. Emotional tone and intent is always morally loaded, meaning emotions always carry an inward intent of either honesty or deception. Let's pretend that your Monday at 2:30 p.m. meeting falls through. The fact that your friend made a commitment to that time explains why you turned down other dates in order to keep this prior appointment. The fact that your friend promised to show explains why you're waiting at 2:30 p.m. for the rendezvous to happen. Remember, people act and respond because of reasons that make sense to them. So there you are, all dressed up and ready, and your friend cancels the dance. In such a situation, many people would feel frustrated, and some might even erupt with anger, or squirt, as I like to call it. They've passed their PQ threshold. Given this situation where a friend fails to show and thereby disrupts your effective use of time and opportunity, any frustrated or angry emotions that well within are all yours. Your emotional response is directly due to your current disposition of character. Your way of responding is explained by your predisposed tendencies to be frustratable, angerable, or possibly drivable up the wallable. In your defense, you may logically reason, but I would not have gotten angry if my friend would have followed through. This is a fact. But it is also true that if you were a more patient person, you would not have gotten angry in the first place. This is why the word unflappable exists in our language, to describe people with a character capacity for unruffled patience. Because persistent patience may not be music you can currently compose, this points to the urgent need for changing your stripes. In the preceding paragraphs, co-authored behavior has been described from the perspective of you being set up by others. They co-author your behavior. Now let's turn the tables and consider co-authored constraints coming from the other direction. You are setting up others for the responses you see coming back to you based upon their disposition of character, their PQ. All behavior is enacted, experienced, and understood within a cooperative context. You co-author the behavior of others. You help create in others the very behaviors you dislike. If you want to know what you're sending out, see what's coming back. The behavior of others always reflects what you're saying, what you're doing, and how you're being. Even though outward doings are created cooperatively, moral responsibility for inward tone and intent is always individual, thus at the level of inner responsibility. If it comes out of you, it's all yours, and if it comes out of them, it's all theirs. The setup flows both ways. Life is a setup, applies both from me to thee and from thee to me. Because the world is filled with inconsiderate, self-serving people, you can expect selfishness to inevitably pester your personal path. Thus, you are impacted and constrained. But please realize that you will also dish out an unloving load of selfishness too. Still, there is great value gleaned from moments when you are mistreated. Now you know how it feels. You have the opportunity to learn empathy for the feelings and afflictions of others through the sufferings you endure. Now consider the rich meaning in Christ's invitation to empathy. Whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even to them. Beyond the value of nurturing an empathetic perspective comes the correcting lessons of karma. Every ounce of energy you send out, positive or negative, honest or deceptive, will return to you at some point in time. For the moment, think in terms of the view that you have been set up and put upon. Recall the situation where your friend failed to show up, Monday at 2:30 p.m. as promised. Logically speaking, what good does it do for you to get upset or angry when the appointment is broken anyway? Regardless of how you respond, the occasion is canceled. The milk is spilt, water is under the bridge, the perfume is out of the bottle, and you can't put the stink back in the skunk. This means you are at choice. You can celebrate it or suffer it. You can be flexible or miserable. The ironic twist is this: people literally do choose the suffer it option. This is what hitting myself with the misery stick means on page 28. But faced with frustration, you may be asking yourself, what is there to celebrate? Consider these possibilities. It's great to be alive. Breathing is definitely good. It's also good to have a friend, period, even one that stands you up occasionally. The words from a Broadway song express this same sentiment. Being alive. Someone to hold you too close. Someone to hurt you too deep. Someone to sit in your chair, to ruin your sleep. To make you aware of being alive. Someone you have to let in. Someone whose feelings you spare. Someone who, like it or not, will want you to share. A little, a lot is being alive. Make me confused, mock me with praise, let me be used, vary my days, for alone is alone, not alive. Somebody crowd me with love, somebody force me to care, somebody let me come through. Always be there, as frightened as you, to help us survive, being alive, being alive. When confronted with a vexing situation, you really can celebrate it. It's possible, and it's even more probable as your spiritual commitments run deep. Consider this. The Apostle Paul was 5 times beaten with 40 stripes, shipwrecked 3 times, unjustly jailed, and survived a stoning, and yet he declared, "But we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope." Return again to the missed appointment scenario. Let's imagine that your spiritual roots are pretty shallow and you choose to suffer it. You decide to get real angry at your rude, unreliable, so-called friend, so you cuss and spit and break a few things. Then later you find out that your friend was seriously injured in an automobile accident. Now how do you view the retarded tantrum that you threw? Every aggravating situation in life exposes your depth of character. Without the mirror of affliction, you cannot clearly see yourself. You will not be aware of your weaknesses or know how to correct your course. So the moral to this story is this. When you are stood up for an appointment, always double check to see if your date has experienced circumstances beyond his or her control. When you know this person is safe and unharmed and stood you up because of inconsiderate selfishness, then and only then should you throw a childish tantrum, cuss, spit, and break a few things. No. Imagine that someone really was injured in an accident, and if you could conjure up concern for this person's bodily well-being, why not expand your concern to another's emotional and spiritual well-being? This means that even if your friend acted out of inconsiderate selfishness, you still have the opportunity to respond compassionately to the emotional car wreck that your friend may be having. Whenever others don't show up for you, there is always an opportunity for you to show up for them, not because they have been good, but because good is who you are. So when a friend fails to show, the obvious options are celebrate it or suffer it, be flexible or miserable, right? Wrong. Now I have your attention. Here's the catch. For certain people, the celebrate it and be flexible options only exist in theory and are not actually choosable because of a deeply entrenched disposition, incapable of choosing a better way. You will see long-term value when faced with affliction only if you are a glass half fullable kind of creature. Else the opposite option will instinctively squirt from you. Your dreary disposition will dump you in the glass half empty ditch by default. It's as simple as this. When provoked by pressure, the virtue of patience cannot proceed from impatient people. Pure water cannot flow from impure fountains. If you sincerely desire to respond compassionately to tough constraints, it's not merely a matter of choosing patience or compassion in that stressful moment. It's too late. Under the press of distress, you will squirt according to your present PQ. You've already set in motion how you will respond or react under pressure. This is precisely why emotion is well conceived as motion, energy in motion. A heartfelt commitment to changing your stripes will set in motion fresh energy that it will spontaneously appear in future days. Compassion and patience will flow from you tomorrow as you initiate loving energy today. Today is the day to put patient and compassionate energy in motion, that it might freely flow from you in future days, effortlessly and naturally like pure water from a pure fountain. In the meantime, you need to get a good grip on who you are right now. You need to take inventory of yourself.